October 1993. At the edge of the Ningxia desert, just outside the city of Yinchuan in northwestern China, the wind sweeps across the old fortress of Zhenbeibao. Dust rolls like smoke through the courtyard as cameras are unpacked, cables dragged across the sand, and a director shouts instructions through the noise. This is the set of An Old Man and His Dog, a film by one of China's most celebrated directors, Xi Jin. A story about loyalty, love, and the bond between a man and his animal. Among the crew stands a young man in a faded denim jacket, wearing dark glasses that hide his eyes. At his side, a yellow wolf dog waits patiently on its leash, calm, obedient, trained to perfection. The dog has just been chosen to star in the movie, and its owner, the man holding the leash, has been hired as its handler. He's even been given a small role in the movie himself, standing in for the lead actor during several key scenes. To everyone here, he seems polite, helpful even, a professional who seems to understand animals better than anyone else. No one looks twice at him. His name is Cheng Peng, and 2 years from now he will make national headlines, and both he and the dog that audiences fall in love with on screen will become part of a story so disturbing that the film itself will be banned. Because behind the calm expression of that young handler lies something darker, a secret he's already begun to bury, a trail of bodies, bones, and brutality. Because Peng is a serial killer, and for years before and after his role in the movie, he had been feeding something much more sinister than meat to his dogs. But on this day, as the camera rolls, nobody knows any of that yet. All they see is a man and his dog, a picture of loyalty, oblivious to the horror waiting to be revealed. This is the story of Cheng Peng, the dog breeder butcher. Cheng Peng was born in 1962 in the city of Yinchuan, the capital of China's Ningxia Autonomous Region. He was the only child of a well-connected family. His mother was attentive and proud. His father was a local government official, what people in China call a cadre, a man with influence, power, and protection. At the time Peng was born, there were no businessmen, no private fortunes, only cadres, and their children walked through life knowing doors would open for them that stayed shut for everyone else. As a result, Peng wanted for nothing, at least in a material sense. There was always food on the table, always new clothes, but comfort didn't make him grateful. It made him restless. He grew up believing he was owed more than the world would ever give him. That sense of entitlement showed early. When other children refused to play the way he wanted, he lashed out. If something didn't go his way, he met it with violence, certain that his father would always step in to smooth things over. There were no consequences, no lessons learned, only a growing awareness that rules were meant for other people, not for him. And his father's presence only reinforced it. According to some accounts, he was so consumed by work that the only times he really paid attention to Peng were after an outburst, after he'd hurt someone or caused trouble that needed cleaning up. It taught Peng something that would follow him for life. That anger and violence got him noticed in ways kindness or obedience never could. As time went on, that pattern only deepened. The older he got, the more vicious he became. Teachers described him as unmanageable, a boy who couldn't be reasoned with. By middle school, he'd been in more fights than anyone could count, yet nothing ever came of it. He was volatile, arrogant, a bully, and everyone still let him get away with it. Until one day when he was around 14, a teacher finally decided to step in, scolding him for tormenting his classmates. Peng snapped. He launched at the man, beating him so badly that the staff had to pull him off. This time, he'd gone too far. And for the first time in his life, there were consequences. The school expelled him. Embarrassed and furious, his father couldn't stop the school from expelling him, but he could make sure no one else heard about it. He pulled strings, silenced teachers, and kept the incident out of official reports. And once again, the lesson Peng learned wasn't humility. It was that rules could be bent and punishment could be avoided. He drifted aimlessly through his teens, gambling, stealing, and boasting about his family's influence and social standing. An influence that continued to open doors for him and to make his problems disappear. Eventually, his father stepped in again. Using his connections, he secured Peng a position at the Ningxia Forestry Research Institute, a respectable government unit where his father also had ties. It was steady work. He repaired tools, helped maintain vehicles, and was assigned a small house inside the institute's residential compound, a quiet courtyard home on the edge of the city. It was a second chance most people didn't get, but one that Peng was all too eager to throw away. He spent his time drinking, smoking, and hanging around with a small circle of shady friends from the city's back streets. His colleagues at the institute found him arrogant and rude. According to them, he constantly acted like the job, and all of them were beneath him. The routine bored him. The rules frustrated him. He thought he deserved more. More freedom, more money, more recognition than the job could ever offer. So he started stealing equipment from the institute and pawning it for quick cash. Not because he really needed it, but because it gave him a sense of power, another way to prove he was untouchable. In 1982, that illusion cracked. He was caught stealing a television set and arrested. But even then, Peng wasn't worried. He'd been protected all his life. He expected his father would just step in again and pay whoever needed paying and make it disappear. But this time, that didn't happen. His father didn't come running. He refused to pull strings or pay anyone off. Instead, he told the police to handle his son like any other criminal, because he was done cleaning up after him. And so he was sentenced to 2 years in prison. When he got out, something in him had changed. He was quieter, colder, but the arrogance, the belief that he was better than everyone else, was still there. Normally, a civil servant convicted of a crime would be immediately fired, but because of who his father was, the institute kept his position open, and when he returned, he was allowed to return to work in the same unit and to continue living in the same house on the compound, almost as if nothing had happened. He kept to himself, rarely engaging with his co-workers, who all felt he continued to treat them with contempt. They described him as moody, cold, and withdrawn. By the late 1980s, Peng had already been suspended at least once, for his attitude and for stealing again. This time, the institute handled it quietly, keeping the police out of it. Some sources claim that was his father's doing, because despite once vowing to let him face the consequences of his actions, his parents still hadn't given up on the idea that he could change. And one of the main ways they tried to achieve this was by arranging a marriage for him, believing it might teach him a sense of respect and responsibility. His new wife was a university-educated researcher at the same forestry institute. She was serious, ambitious, and respected by her peers, everything Peng wasn't. But she was rarely home, often away on long assignments in the field. The marriage was distant from the start. Peng resented her independence, her calm authority, and the quiet respect she commanded among colleagues. The more he compared their reputations, the more he hated it. He spent his days with his old crowd from the back streets, gambling, drinking, drifting, or sitting alone in the courtyard of his government house, smoking and stewing in silence. And that was when he began collecting dogs. They were the only thing he seemed to care about other than himself. Initially, he kept a few as pets. Then he fenced off part of the yard and began breeding wolf dogs, large, aggressive crossbreeds, normally used for guarding warehouses and factory yards. And soon there were more than 20, snarling behind the wire, half-starved and fierce. His terrified neighbours avoided his gate. At night, they said they heard gunshots, the sound of Peng firing at chickens and ducks for sport, before tossing their carcasses to his dogs. The noise was constant. Gunfire, barking, the clatter of metal bowls. But because his father was a cader, no one complained. And day by day, he trained his dogs to be more obedient to him and more vicious and violent to everything and everyone else. By the time he turned 26, Peng had basically become a fully formed version of what he always was, a man convinced the world owed him something, and that pain, whether animal or human, was his to command. And soon that belief would lead him to kill. In March 1988, a green carriage train rattled across the dry plains of Gansu, carrying traders, students, and farmers on their way home. Among them sat Peng. Somewhere between Lanzhou and Yinchuan, he struck up a conversation with a young woman sitting across the aisle. Her name was Zhao. She was 23, newly graduated, and heading to Yinchuan to visit her relatives. Despite everything you've heard so far, Peng knew how to present as charming and trustworthy when he wanted to. He told Zhao stories about his work at the Forestry Institute, hinted at his family's government connections, and even bragged that he could help her find a good job in the city. To a young woman from a smaller town, he seemed worldly, the kind of man who knew people and could help open doors for you. By the time the train pulled into Yinchuan, they had already exchanged numbers, and before parting ways, Peng told her he'd love to show her around the city sometime. Polite and curious, Zhao agreed. The next day, he went looking for her and found her exactly where she said she was staying. He took her out to eat, walked around the streets with her, and they even saw a movie together. When night came, he invited her back to his home, an offer she accepted. In that quiet corner of the Forestry Institute compound, behind the high walls and the barking dogs, they spent the night together. Afterward, Zhao returned home to her relatives. But over the following weeks, she came back to see Peng again and again. And soon their relationship, at least in her mind, became serious. She began talking about finding work in Yinchuan and maybe even settling there. But for Peng, the novelty of the affair had already faded. He wanted her gone. On April 13th, 1988, she came to stay the night once more while his wife was away on a field assignment. The next morning, as Zhao washed up in the sink, Peng stood behind her, watching. On the table nearby lay a pair of pliers he'd been using to fix a dog cage. And in that moment, something came over him. He grabbed the pliers and struck Zhao in the back of the head. She collapsed instantly, but Peng wasn't finished. He looped a rope around her neck and pulled until she stopped breathing. The whole thing was over within seconds. For a while he just stood there, staring at what he'd done. But he wasn't panicked. He was excited, flooded by a strange sense of relief. And then, almost methodically, like a man tidying up after a day's work, he began to clean. He dragged her body out into the courtyard, stripped it of clothing, and left it there, planning to deal with it later. But when he came back the next morning, what he saw stopped him cold. The dogs, the pack he'd trained and fed for years, had devoured most of the body. All that remained were bones, scraps of flesh and hair, and some ripped clothing scattered across the yard. He gathered up what bones were left and buried them beneath the cages, smoothing the dirt flat. Any remaining flesh or tissue he shoveled into the kennel troughs for the dogs to finish off. Then he poured fresh concrete over the grave and set up another wire enclosure on top of it. No one in the compound noticed anything unusual. The dogs were loud at night anyway, and they'd learnt to just ignore the noise and commotion from Peng's house over the years. For days afterwards, he couldn't stop thinking about it. Not the murder itself, but how easy it had been. No one had come. No one had asked questions. The body had just disappeared. As far as Zhao's family were concerned, she had stayed behind in the city. They assumed she'd found a job and started a new life. They never could have imagined that her final resting place was just a few feet beneath a kennel of barking dogs. And for a while, nothing happened. Peng went back to work, walked the same corridors at the institute, fed his dogs, smiled at his neighbours. But something inside him had changed. From that moment on, he no longer saw his dogs as just companions. They were accomplices. He could kill anyone he wanted, and they would destroy the evidence for him. He no longer had to hold back his violent impulses. He'd crossed a line he could never come back from. But just like every moment he'd lashed out as a child, there were no consequences for what he'd done. While he hadn't specifically planned to kill Zhao, the rush it gave him was overwhelming. And the idea of doing it again thrilled him. Winter 1990. 2 years had passed since the woman on the train. Inside the Forestry Institute compound, his dogs continued barking through the night, their noise so constant that neighbours barely even acknowledged them. To everyone else, life continued as normal. But Peng had changed. The violence had awakened something in him. Dominating animals no longer satisfied his craving for control. He had seen how far fear and loyalty could be pushed in his dogs. And now he wanted to find out if he could instill that same obedience in other people. He wanted a crew, a small circle of men he could command, who would both fear and admire him. His first recruit was his cousin, Xiaodan, a naive young temp at the institute. He was younger, impressionable, and eager to make some quick money. When Peng suggested forming a crew to carry out big jobs to make big money, Xiaodan agreed without hesitation. But first he told him that they needed weapons. In October, Peng learned that a subsidiary warehouse at the institute had just received a shipment of equipment which he believed contained guns. So on the night of October 18th, he and Xiaodan climbed onto the roof of the building, prized open the tiles, and slipped inside. In wooden crates they found exactly what they'd hoped for: 8 shotguns and loads of boxes of ammunition. They took everything. Back at Peng's house, they sawed down 2 of the barrels and removed the stocks to make the guns easier to hide. Then they stashed the remainder above a shed. To practice, Peng hung stolen chickens and ducks in the yard and fired until the birds stopped moving. He fed the carcasses to his dogs. His neighbours were already accustomed to loud noises from his property, including gunfire at night. They didn't even look twice. Despite telling his new recruit they were going to carry out big jobs together and get rich, over the following weeks, all they stole were petty goods from the institute and a few private homes. They never fired a shot, and they fled at the sign of any guards. In total, they stole around 10,000 yuan worth of goods. But that December, an opportunity arose to make some real money when Yu Dawei, a younger acquaintance who worked at the Great Wall Trading Company, vented to Peng that his manager Li owed him 3,000 yuan and was refusing to pay. So Peng promised to help collect the debt, his own way of pulling Dawei into the crew and of securing a bigger target. On December 22nd, Peng and Xiaodan took 2 of their guns to the Yinchuan train station, planning to hire a taxi, kill the driver, and steal the car, which they would then use to pick up Dawei and go and visit Mr. Li. They waved down a white minivan, driven by a man named Yang, and asked for a fare out toward Yongning County. As the road narrowed past a brick kiln, Peng saw his opportunity and asked to stop so he could pee. But Yang refused, telling him there was a public toilet further along the route he could use instead. As the minivan continued driving, Peng glanced at his cousin and nodded. So Xiaodan fired his weapon. But with his hands trembling, he missed Yang, tearing through the door instead. Yang thought a tire had burst and jumped out to check. When he saw the hole in the door, Peng suddenly shouted, "Someone's shooting at us, get in!" Panicked, Yang jumped back in and sped back toward the city, straight to Peng's house, where he said they'd settle the fare. As they arrived, Peng offered him some tea to calm his nerves after what had happened, but as soon as Yang stepped through the doorway, Xiaodan raised his gun and fired. The blast hit Yang in the back of the head, killing him instantly. They then wrapped his body in canvas and went looking for Dawei, hoping he'd help deal with it. After all, they'd done this for him, or so they told themselves. But Dawei wasn't home, so the 2 men handled it alone, stripping the corpse and pocketing anything of value. When Xiaodan asked what they should do with the body next, Peng simply looked outside and signaled to the dogs. Xiaodan was speechless. Peng fetched a machete and set to work. Piece by piece, he dismembered the body and tossed the remains to the dogs, who devoured them eagerly, just as he'd promised they would. Whatever scraps they left, he buried behind the kennels. The next morning, Peng gathered the last fragments, the skull and blood-soaked clothes, and dumped them in an unused boiler room behind the institute. The damaged minivan was abandoned overnight in a parking lot in the city. It was Peng's second murder, and the first he'd planned from beginning to end. Two weeks later, on January 8th, 1991, Dawei showed up at Peng's house, asking if he'd managed to collect the money yet. Peng poured him a drink, offered dinner, and told him it was time to settle things with Mr. Li, together. So he called Xiaodan and arranged to meet him outside the Nanmen bus station. The 3 men climbed into a beige Polonaise taxi driven by a man called Zhang and told him to drive them to a quiet area on the southern outskirts of the city. When they reached a dirt road, Peng told him to stop. As the car slowed, Xiaodan subtly raised his shotgun and fired. But the sudden jolt of the brakes threw his aim off, and the blast shattered the windshield instead. Zhang immediately bolted from the car, shouting for help. But the ground was icy and frozen, making it difficult to run. Peng stepped out, aimed his gun, and fired until he fell to his knees. As the 3 men approached him, Zhang begged for them to spare his life. Instead, Peng handed the gun to Dawei and ordered him to finish the job. Dawei hesitated, gripping the weapon with trembling hands. After a long moment, he lowered it. He couldn't do it, and handed it back. Without hesitation, Peng fired a single shot into Zhang's head, killing him instantly. According to some accounts, he then cut off Zhang's head with a knife, tossing it into the weeds. They then shoved the body into the trunk of the taxi, driving off to go and confront manager Li at his office. Now realizing that they likely intended to kill Mr. Li, Dawei told them that it was too late. The office would be closed, so there'd be no point going there now. So Peng drove him back to his home and let him out. Sensing how shaken he was by what had happened, he warned him to keep quiet about it. He and Xiaodan then drove to somewhere secluded and dug a shallow pit, tossing the corpse into it. But as they drove away, Peng suddenly changed his mind. He turned the car around, dug up the body, and took it home. Like his first two victims, he fed it to the dogs, before burying anything that remained under fresh concrete. Given the taxi's windshield was blown out, they chose to ditch it, abandoning it in the Dongfeng bathhouse parking lot. Even when it was discovered, nobody connected it to the white van and the missing taxi driver from 2 weeks ago. The police investigated the cases, but there were no witnesses, no CCTV footage to review, and not even any bodies. Both cases soon went cold. Within days, Dawei began to distance himself from the group, and before long, he'd cut contact with them entirely, too scared of what he'd witnessed. But Peng wasn't concerned. That fear, he believed, would keep Dawei quiet, and his own arrogance convinced him it always would. 2 drivers were murdered in cold blood, and nobody had noticed. In the evenings, Peng sat in his courtyard smoking, watching the dogs circle under the yellow light. The killings had become effortless. There was no panic, no guilt, no trace of what he'd done. And soon, that hunger, that need to feel the power of it again, would return. But this time, the target wouldn't be a stranger on the road. It would be someone who thought she loved him. After the murders of the 2 drivers, Peng kept his head down. He went back to his usual routine at the Forestry Institute and continued as if everything was completely normal. Then, without fanfare, he filed for unpaid leave, an arrangement that let him keep his government title while living entirely on his own terms. He told his colleagues he wanted to go into business, and on paper it sounded respectable enough. Around the compound, word spread that he was breeding wolf dogs to sell for security work, a small venture that seemed to make sense to everyone. And for a while, it worked. The barking, the late nights, the comings and goings. It all looked like a man keeping busy, building a trade. On the surface, he seemed calmer, more focused, almost reformed. But behind closed doors, nothing had changed. He spent his days drinking and gambling, drifting between card rooms and backstreet bars. In the courtyard, he lingered for hours with his dogs, feeding them, training them, watching them rip at meat with a fascination that bordered on obsession. Because beneath that calm exterior, the darkness hadn't gone. It was simply waiting, like one of his dogs, trained to obey until he called upon it. He'd learned how easy it was to kill, and how intoxicating it could be. All it needed now was a reason. In the winter of 1991, the brightest place in the city wasn't the government square or the new hotels. It was the Tongfuju ballroom, a swirl of red lights, cigarette haze, and music from a battered tape deck. That was where Peng met Liu, a lively factory worker in her early 20s. After seeing her on the dance floor, Peng approached her between songs. He put on his mask of charm as he smiled and laughed with her, before offering to buy her a drink. By the end of the evening, they'd agreed to meet again the next night. And when they met the next night, she went home with him. And over the next few weeks, they danced, drank, and stayed the night together on multiple occasions. But then one evening, between cigarettes and laughter, she said something that changed everything. She told him that she was trying to arrange a wedding with her fiancé, but money was tight. If he could lend her 3,000 yuan, she said, she could finally move forward with it. She likely believed Peng was wealthy, because he often boasted about his father's position and exaggerated the success of his barely established dog business. But her request hit a nerve. It made him feel used, like she'd only ever seen him as a source of money. She never saw his anger though. He smiled, told her to give him 10 days, and promised he'd have the money ready. Overjoyed, she thanked him, kissed him goodnight, and left. For the next 10 days, Peng planned. He stopped feeding several of his dogs, leaving them hungrier than ever. He waited until his wife was gone on another field assignment. Then, on the agreed night, Liu returned. They ate dinner, danced to a cassette on the old player. They even slept together. The next morning, as Liu stood by the table fixing her hair in the mirror, Peng watched her reflection. It reminded him of the moment he'd watched Zhao years earlier. So ordinary, so unguarded. He lifted one of the sawed-off shotguns he'd hidden beneath the bed, aimed at the back of her head, and the blast echoed across the compound. But to the neighbours, it was nothing unusual, nothing they didn't hear every other day from his house. Liu fell where she stood. Peng stripped her body, tied a rope around her neck, and dragged her outside and into his neighbour's yard, a space he'd borrowed while his neighbour was away. It was also where his starved, aggressive dogs were waiting. He locked the gate and left. 3 days later, he came back to find the yard silent. All that remained of Liu were gnawed bones, scraps of hair, and the shredded rope. He gathered what he could find and carelessly tossed her skull onto the roof of his own house. Then he buried the remaining bones beneath the kennels and burnt the clothes. He didn't care that the neighbour, or anyone else, could have entered the yard during the days he left her body out in the open. He didn't worry that someone might see the skull on his roof. As far as he was concerned, he was untouchable. Nobody knew about his affair. Nobody came asking questions, and just like before, it was like nothing had ever even happened. By 1993, the business that had once been a cover story had become real. What started as an excuse for Peng, a way to explain the noise, the dogs, the constant activity, had turned into something that looked respectable. People came and went from his courtyard, curious about the wolf dogs behind the wire. He spoke with authority about bloodlines, temperament, and training, always the expert, always in control. Soon he wasn't just the odd man with too many dogs. He was a breeder, a businessman, a man who seemed to know what he was doing. That spring, the western desert outside of Yinchuan stirred with excitement. A famous director, Xie Jin, had arrived to film An Old Man and His Dog, a sentimental story about loyalty and loss. The set was built among the crumbling walls of the ancient Zhenbeibao fortress, a maze of courtyards and battlements left from the Ming dynasty. Trucks rolled in with lights and props. In the early 1990s, film was still a rare spectacle in rural China. When a movie screen went up, people would walk for miles to see it. So when the film crew arrived in Ningxia, excitement swept the region and crowds gathered just to watch the cameras roll. But there was a problem. The production couldn't find the right dog. Xie Jin wanted an animal with presence, an obedient dog that could convey gentleness, patience, and sorrow. They placed ads on the radio, on TV, and in newspapers, resulting in endless auditions. For days, villagers, breeders, and hobbyists lined up at the gates. But he rejected every one of them. None had the look or temperament he wanted. Without the dog, many scenes couldn't be shot, and nobody knew how long the schedule would have to be delayed, or how expensive it would get if they couldn't find it soon. But just as they were starting to panic, a man arrived in a denim jacket and dark glasses, leading a dog by a rope. The animal was lean, bright-eyed, and obedient. It responded to every gesture, every click of the man's tongue. Xie Jin knew instantly that he'd found his star. That man was Peng, and that dog was one of the many that had already tasted human flesh. Peng was hired on the spot as the dog's handler, and the director even offered him a small role in the movie to thank him, doubling for the lead actor in a few long-shot scenes, including a scene driving a horse and cart across the dunes. During the weeks of filming, Peng was almost unrecognizable. He was attentive, polite, and eager to please. The crew saw only a calm, reliable animal handler, a man who seemed to understand dogs better than most people could ever dream of. When the film wrapped and was released the following year, it was an instant hit. It was labelled as one of the best films of the year by Chinese critics, and won numerous awards. Audiences across China were moved by its story, praising the dog in particular for its performance. And in Yinchuan, everyone wanted to meet the man who had trained it, and to take pictures with the animal star. Peng soaked in the attention. He told stories about working with the crew, about the famous actors he'd met, about how his dog had performed perfectly, often only needing a single take. The local papers even mentioned him by name, with small magazines running blurbs about the breeder from Ningxia who trained the film's star. His business flourished as a result. Farmers came to buy pups from him. Security companies came to find guard dogs. The same animals that had eaten his victims were now earning him praise and money. Among the many people who came to see him was someone from the film crew, a married woman called Yu. She was 7 years older than him and seemed to be genuinely curious about his animals. Conversations about their time working on the movie soon turned into deep chats about life, and before long she was coming to visit him regularly. Yu had admired Peng during the shoot, fascinated by his composure and the way he handled his dog. She told him that he seemed like a real man, the kind who knew what he wanted and didn't care what anyone thought. They became so close that Peng even gave her a key to his house, telling her she could come by any time his wife was away. For a while, the affair gave Peng that sense of control he always craved again, the thrill of being wanted, the comfort of being admired. But then one day, everything changed. In April 1994, Yu called Peng. She told him she'd been away in Hebei after her father's death, and before returning home again, she wanted to see him, as there was something important she needed to tell him. They met the next day. After having dinner at one of the best restaurants in the city, they sang karaoke together. It was all smiles and laughter. By midnight, they were back at Peng's house. As she lay against him with her head on his chest, she quietly told him that she was pregnant, and that the baby was his. Peng pretended to be happy, reassuring her and holding her until she fell asleep. But he had no intention of having a child. At dawn, Yu got up to wash. She sat in front of the mirror, humming softly as she began to do her makeup. Behind her, Peng lifted the sawed-off shotgun from beneath the bed and aimed it at her back. There was no hesitation, no fear, just... She fell forward, her face still turned toward the mirror, looking into the reflection to see his shadow leering behind her. Then, Peng lowered the gun, knelt down beside her, and strangled her with his bare hands. When she'd stopped moving, he opened her handbag and took her cash, her gold earrings, and her necklace, and went outside. Beneath a grapevine in his yard, he dug a shallow pit and lowered the body inside. He didn't dismember her, didn't feed her to his dogs. This time, he just buried her body. He covered the grave with earth and burned a small stack of joss paper, thin ceremonial sheets meant to send offerings to the dead, as his own twisted gesture of farewell. And just like with his previous 4 victims, nobody came looking for her. But every pattern breaks eventually, and the next time he pulled the trigger, it would finally mark the beginning of his end. A month after Yu vanished, a man in glasses rolled up to Peng's gate on a bicycle and stared at him for a beat, as if he was trying to remember something. Eventually he said, "Don't you recognize me?" before announcing his name as Ma Wei from junior high. Wei had heard Peng was breeding dogs, he said. He was just about to purchase more than 10 Tibetan Mastiffs and needed advice on how to train them and how to handle a pack. Peng nodded along, his mind already doing the maths. Tibetan Mastiffs sold for real money. So as soon as Wei pedaled off, Peng phoned Xiaodan and told him there might be an opportunity coming their way. He'd arranged for Wei to come back the next day on his way to pick the dogs up, meaning he would likely have a lot of money when he arrived. But when Wei returned to his house, he stepped out of a police car, wearing his uniform. He was a police officer. Whatever plan Peng had in mind died immediately. After humouring Wei and talking about dogs with him, he let him walk away alive, because even Peng wasn't arrogant enough to think he could get away with murdering a police officer. But he wasn't the only old face who was drawn in by Peng's newfound fame and reputation. First there was another former classmate, Li Sanwei. Sanwei worked in a nitrogen fertilizer plant and had vented to Peng about his low pay, late wages, and his general anger at the world. When Peng asked if he'd do anything for money, Sanwei said yes without blinking. Zhang Ming was also a former classmate who crossed paths with him. Ming had become a deputy manager at a trading company in the city's new development zone, and at first the reunion was friendly, two men from the same school talking business and money. But one evening over drinks, Ming mentioned something that lit a spark in Peng's brain. He had raised 1.5 million yuan for a cashmere wool deal. That number drowned out everything else in Peng's head, every other target, every other plan. So he invited Ming to his home for dinner in early January of 1995, saying he wanted to discuss an investment opportunity. When Ming arrived, Sanwei was also at the house. The three men sat down to eat dinner, talk business, and reminisce over their shared past. But as Ming sipped tea, he suddenly felt his eyelids sink. The tea had been laced with sleeping pills by Peng, and as soon as the drugs began taking effect, he pulled out one of his sawed-off shotguns and thrust it into Sanwei's hands. He told him to shoot Ming to show that he was serious about doing anything for money. But Sanwei's bravado quickly collapsed. He shook his head and passed the gun back. So Peng fired it himself. Terrified, Sanwei helped him drag the body into the yard, where it was buried beneath the grapevine, alongside Yu. Then, Peng took Ming's keys and went straight to his home with Sanwei, who was too frightened to say no. Ming kept a separate flat near the development zone, away from his family. So when Peng and Sanwei let themselves in with his keys, the place was empty. They searched every drawer and cabinet, looking for the 1.5 million yuan that Ming had bragged about before. But there was no fortune waiting for them. Just a few hundred yuan in cash, a small stack of bonds, and a new pager on the dresser. Peng snatched the money and bonds, clipped the pager to his belt, and walked out as if it were his. When it was done, he told Sanwei to go home and to keep his mouth shut. He didn't have to say what would happen if he didn't. The next evening, Peng called Ming's home from a payphone. When his wife answered, Peng tried to disguise his voice, claiming he was a business partner as he questioned her about the money. But Ming's wife just told him she didn't know anything about that stuff and that he should just call her husband. But something about it felt off to her, so she called her husband's business partner, Mr. Wang, to check what was going on. Mr. Wang told her he hadn't seen Ming for a couple of days, but offered to page him and check that everything was okay. A few minutes after he paged Ming, he received a call back. But it wasn't his business partner on the phone, it was Peng. Peng introduced himself, giving his full name, and then he told him that Ming had gone south on business. He'd needed to borrow 3,000 yuan from him, so he'd left the pager as collateral. He wasn't sure when he'd be back. Mr. Wang didn't buy the story, and neither did Ming's wife. On January 11th, Mrs. Zhang filed a missing person report with the police. It didn't take long for the authorities to hone in on Peng. Ming had told his wife he was going to meet him before he'd seemingly vanished, and Peng had identified himself by name to Mr. Wang on the phone. On January 16th, they brought him in for questioning. But Peng was calm and collected, sticking to his story, though he expanded on it a little. Peng told them that Ming was in Yunnan doing a drug deal, alongside relatives from Lanzhou. This was why he hadn't told Mr. Wang or his wife about it, and why he'd had to ask him for money, leaving his pager and bonds as collateral. When the officers checked his story, they found nothing. He did have relatives from Lanzhou, but they simply laughed at the notion that Ming would run drugs or disappear on any sort of business trip without telling his wife. With it clear to everyone that Peng was lying, he switched tactics and suddenly went silent. He refused to cooperate. He wouldn't give them the confession they wanted. He wouldn't answer any more of their questions. He wouldn't even eat the food they gave him. After 2 days, they still had nothing solid enough to hold him. So he was escorted back to his house by officers to assist in a search of his property. He wasn't even in cuffs. As they approached the gate, the yard erupted. More than 20 wolf dogs pounded against the wire fencing, barking and snarling. Peng offered to go through the gate first so he could lock the dogs inside their kennels. But as he slipped into the yard, he suddenly bolted. The officers rushed into the yard to pursue him, but his snarling dogs swarmed them, holding them back. Peng then vaulted onto the kennel roof, and in one fluid movement, he disappeared over the far wall and into the scrub. By the time the officers had fought through the barking dogs, he was gone. After finally securing the animals, they entered the house anyway. The smell was what hit them first, a thick metallic tang embedded in the wood and plaster. Dark dried flecks were on the door frames, lampshades, and even the ceiling. They were suspicious looking enough for them to take samples to be analysed. Within hours, the flecks were confirmed to be human blood. So an entire team descended on the property. It didn't take long for the 8 hidden shotguns to be discovered, which all still had their serial numbers intact. They were quickly identified as the same batch stolen from a Forestry Institute warehouse years earlier. Out in the yard, a police dog pawed at a freshly dug patch of soil. Spades went in, and the body of Jiang Ming came out. Their missing person case had just become a murder case. But then they found another trench, and in it, another body. A woman's remains, already deep into decay. The more they searched the property, the more they found. They began uncovering the buried bones of Peng's other victims in bundles, some under his kennels, others in the neighbour's yard, a skull on the roof. But most disturbingly, it was immediately clear that all of the bones had been gnawed and chewed. There were even human bones still laying inside the kennels. Room by room, pit by pit, the story assembled itself. This was a graveyard, one that had taken years to build. It wasn't just a murder case, it was a serial killer case, and one of the most disturbing that the nation had ever seen. That same day, January 18th, 1995, the Public Security Bureau issued a citywide bulletin, and the manhunt had begun. Police checkpoints sprang up immediately, covering all the main exits from the city. Officers searched trains, buses, and rural roads, but Peng had already vanished. In the early hours after his escape, he fled along the Yinggu highway, keeping to the edges of farmland and avoiding major roads until he found what he was looking for, somewhere quiet and warm to hide. A few miles outside the city, he stumbled across a school for the deaf that was closed for the winter. Beneath one of the buildings ran a heating trench, still pumping warm air through the pipes. He climbed down, pressed his hands to the metal, and decided to stay. For the next 10 days, Peng hid underground. He purchased food from a nearby stall, drank water from a leaky tap, and tried to wait out the search above. When the winter cold became unbearable and he began running out of money for supplies, he set off into the night. He convinced a farmer to sell him an old cotton coat and hat and kept heading north, telling anyone who asked that he had been cheated out of his savings. Along the roadside, he saw his own face staring back at him from wanted posters nailed to telephone poles. The Public Security Bureau had issued a 30,000 yuan reward for his capture, and by that point, they had expanded the manhunt for him nationwide. But Peng wasn't the only one being hunted. Investigators had begun tracing his connections, and one name kept coming up: his cousin, Xiaodan. They learnt that the two had been inseparable. Witnesses told them Xiaodan was often at Peng's house and had been seen firing guns with him. Yinchuan police tracked him down to Shenzhen, which was more than 1,000 miles away, and arrested him on January 29th. During questioning, Xiaodan confessed to everything. He admitted that he and Peng had stolen the guns and ammo from the Forestry Institute warehouse, and that alongside Yu Dawei, they had ambushed and murdered 2 taxi drivers back in 1990. As a result of his statements, Dawei was arrested a couple of days later as well. With his 2 accomplices in custody and a clearer picture of Peng's crimes emerging, the search for him intensified. But Peng just kept moving. He crossed into Inner Mongolia, boarding a bus under a false name, Bai Baoshan. By pure coincidence, years later the nation would be haunted by another serial killer with that actual name. He checked into a roadside inn in Otog Front Banner before moving again to the nearby town of Uxin Banner. It was Chinese New Year, so most businesses were shut and most of the streets were empty. Peng wandered until he found a small family restaurant run by a man named Shu and his son. He told them a story about how he'd been robbed, claiming he couldn't walk properly and needed somewhere to rest. Pitying him, they gave him a meal and a bed for the night, warning that he'd have to leave in the morning. The next day, he met the bus station watchman. Believing his story, he introduced him to an elderly healer, a self-styled witch doctor who was looking for an assistant. The healer offered him a place to stay in exchange for help with chores. For the next 2 months, Peng lived as the witch doctor's apprentice, tending a small fire and carrying supplies from the market. He also worked occasional shifts at a nearby coal mine to earn some money, keeping his head down. But he lived in constant fear of being recognised. So on March 10th, he broke into a local police station, hoping to find a gun to arm himself. He didn't find any firearms inside, only pistol magazines, but he did locate over 100 ID cards. He kept any that he felt resembled himself and burned the rest. 9 days later, he struck again. He forced open the doors of 2 government offices, but this time he found only bullets. And by then, word of the break-ins and rumours of a stranger in the area had reached the local authorities, leading to an increase in patrols. So Peng slipped away once more, this time heading south toward Shanxi province. Eventually, after drifting aimlessly for a number of days and struggling to stay hidden, he decided to go back to the school where he knew it was safe and warm. But when he returned to it, it had been locked shut and the heating had been turned off. Unsure where else to hide, he travelled to Pingliang and checked into a cheap hotel using one of the stolen ID cards. For 10 days, he stayed there living off what little cash he had left. But when he ran out of money, he decided to risk one last move, this time to Xi'an. He had a nephew who managed a sandcasting factory in the city's Weiyang district. But when he arrived on April 13th, his nephew wasn't there. Instead, a distant relative he'd never met before welcomed him into the factory, poured him tea, and asked him to wait for his nephew to return. But as the man looked closer at him, something clicked in his head. He'd seen his face before, on a wanted poster offering a reward of 30,000 yuan. Making an excuse to leave the room, he told one of the guards to call the police before returning to Peng to keep him talking. Minutes later, 6 plainclothes officers arrived at the factory. 2 of them entered the office, pretending to be customers, and as soon as Peng turned to look at them, they lunged at him. He barely had time to stand before he was slammed to the floor and handcuffed. After 85 days on the run, the killer who had fed his victims to his dogs was now shackled, thin and expressionless. Peng barely spoke during the journey back to Yinchuan, staring out the window as they drove him through the same streets where his wanted posters still hung. He was immediately charged with 6 counts of first-degree murder, and Xiaodan and Dawei were also both charged for their roles as his accomplices. At his trial, Xiaodan openly admitted that he had assisted Peng in multiple robberies, including stealing the shotguns from the Forestry Institute, and even confessed that he had killed the 2 taxi drivers with his cousin. Dawei also confirmed his involvement in the taxi driver murders during his trial. Like his accomplices, Peng didn't deny what he'd done. But in stark contrast to them, he bragged and boasted about it, as if he was proud of it. He claimed the 3 women he'd murdered had all interfered with his family life, and so deserved to die. The 3 men he'd murdered, on the other hand, were all killed because he wanted something from them. Money, a car, whatever. He confessed without hesitation to all 6 murders, gloating that the investigators would never find all the body parts because he'd fed them to his dogs. Reporters who were allowed into the courtroom described him as cold, calm, and seeming almost bored, as if the entire thing was somehow beneath him. When asked if he regretted any of it, he simply said, no. So the judge pressed him further, asking what he felt after killing so many people. Peng's reply was another single word: happiness. When a reporter later asked him if he ever felt afraid living among the corpses of his victims, Peng shrugged and remarked, "I don't believe in ghosts or gods." Outside the courthouse, the public outrage was immense. This wasn't just a murderer, this was a man who had taken pleasure in his violent depravity, whose victims had included lovers, friends, and strangers. But what horrified people even more was that one of the dogs he'd used to dispose of his victims had once been loved by audiences across China. People had come from all over the country to see it and take pictures with it. The revelation sent shockwaves through the country. The gentle creature that had made filmgoers cry was now known to have eaten human flesh. Almost overnight, an old man and his dog was pulled from circulation. The film was instantly banned, and it would be almost 20 years before it would be seen again. On September 27, 1995, the Yinchuan Intermediate People's Court held a public sentencing rally. In front of a packed crowd, Peng and Xiaodan were stripped of their political rights for life and sentenced to death. Dawei received a suspended death sentence for his smaller role in the crimes. As we've seen before, justice moves quickly in China. So minutes later, Peng and Xiaodan were escorted to the execution ground outside the city, and both men were immediately shot. That same day, every single one of Peng's dogs, including the yellow dog who'd starred in the film, were executed by a firing squad. The authorities feared they might have grown accustomed to the taste of human flesh and were worried they might attack someone if left alive. In the years that followed, people in Yinchuan stopped saying Peng's name out loud. But sometimes, when an old man and his dog came up in conversation, the air in the room would seem to change, as if everyone suddenly remembered what lay behind that story. The man, the kennel, the yellow dog. When the film was quietly re-released decades later, Peng's name had been erased from the credits, and every frame he appeared in had been cut away. But even so, few could bring themselves to watch it. Because no matter how moving the story of loyalty and devotion was meant to be, everyone knew the truth. That the dog on screen, the one audiences had once adored, had fed on human flesh, and that its master, smiling just off camera, had long since lost every trace of his own humanity. Peng had once said that he didn't believe in ghosts or gods, but after what he did, many people believed that wherever he went next, both were waiting for him. And with that, our deep dive into the case of Cheng Peng, the dog breeder butcher, comes to a close. As always, thanks so much for watching. If you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe, and to do all the other stuff that feeds the bellies of the ever-so-hungry algorithm gods. I'm trying hard to keep putting out videos once a week, but I'm just so behind at the moment. My videos are taking me longer and longer to research, write, and make. I might not be the most talented creator in the world, but I'm trying my best to keep up the quality and to keep improving all the time, and I just can't produce videos at the speed I want to right now. So apologies if I'm a little bit inconsistent at the moment. It doesn't help that all of YouTube's algorithm changes over the last few months have made everything wildly unpredictable either. But anyway, if you want to support my channel further, there's a membership option here on YouTube and a Patreon linked in the description down below. They're really just gestures of support right now, so don't feel any obligation to join either, though you will get to see your name on screen if you do, alongside all the lovely folks coming up in a few seconds. Oh, and I'm pretty sure I'm supposed to tell you to check out some of my other videos at this point too, right? I never remember to do that, and I really should start doing that. If the algorithm gods ask, tell them I did it. So until next time, you have been watching The Mystery Abyss.